Welcome to our program this evening. I'm Casey Vance. I'm the Executive Director at the Ames Historical Society. And I want to welcome you to our lecture about the Manhattan Project this evening. This is the final lecture in our series for this spring. We already have the date set for next year's lecture series, so be looking for an announcement about that here. We're again fortunate to have the Ames Public Library as a partner for this lecture series. And we're also fortunate to have our volunteer Kathy Speck organize this outstanding series of programs again this year. If you've not yet stopped across the street at the History Center to see our exhibit Ames High, Aiming High Through the Years, I encourage you to do so. It'll be up until August 11th, and we're open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4. And we'd also like to recognize and thank those of you who are currently members of the Ames Historical Society. We couldn't do the things we do without your support. And if you're not a member but you're interested, we do have some brochures on the table outside the door. At this time, I ask that you turn off all your cell phones and electronic devices if you've not already done so. And we do have assisted listening devices available in this room if you need one, so just let us know. And now I'll turn it over to Kathy Speck to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Teresa Wilhelm Waldof has become, by her own extensive study, a leading expert on the Ames, Iowa State section of the Manhattan Project. She is a successful business executive who took time off from her career to write her book, The Boy from Pumptown. The book is scheduled to be published prior to the 75th anniversary of the Allies' victory over Japan, which would be 2020. So we're all crossing our fingers and hoping that Teresa tracks down a publisher. Much of her research was done right here in Ames, especially in special collections at Parks Library at Iowa State University. Teresa holds both a Bachelor of Arts in Speech Communications and a Bachelor of Business Administration from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Harley Wilhelm was her grandfather, and she knew him for the last 35 years of his life. Teresa resides in Rochester, Minnesota, but always appreciates the opportunity to come to Ames, where as a child she often visited her grandparents, leaving her with many fond memories. Now, I know that Teresa's going to do a few introductions of some very special people here tonight, but I would like to ask anybody in the audience who knew Harley personally to raise their hand. Leave your name with Teresa. She has been collecting stories from people who knew Harley for the last how many years? 2 or 3 years, at least. I'm pretty sure that most of the people who actually worked on the Manhattan Project at Iowa State are gone now. But are there family members in the audience who had a parent or a sibling working on the Manhattan Project? Raise your hand. So we have some very, very personal connections to this story. So Teresa, are you ready?
Yeah.
Let's take it away. Is anybody sitting next to an empty chair by any chance? I think every chair is definitely full, and I apologize to those who are standing. Whoops, is there something over there? Someone who'd like to sit, just mosey on over there, don't be shy, make yourself comfortable.
Good evening. That's so nice. As Kathy mentioned, my grandfather was Dr. Harley Wilhelm. And first I'd like to ask, can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Terrific. I decided to write this book because something happened way back in 1985. I was in my 20s, and my parents called and they said, you need to come down to Ames, they're naming a building after your grandfather. I'm like, what? Why would they be naming a building after my grandfather? Well, it turns out he was this bigwig professor that I didn't know. He was just grandpa to me, and every day when we would come down and visit, he would go off to the laboratory and do his experiments and do his work, and I didn't think anything of it. And I ended up coming down to Ames in '85 for that building dedication. And I got there, and the newspaper was there, the TV station was there, bigwigs from Washington, D.C. were there, and I'm like, what is going on? And I was in my 20s, it still really didn't dawn on me, but one thing was said, and I still remember it to this day, the quote. It was Dr. Iannella, and he was from the Department of Energy in Washington, D.C. And he said, and I remember this, if it weren't for Harley Wilhelm, we'd all be speaking Japanese right now. I'm like, woo, that's pretty big. So I always remembered that, but I got on with my life and my career and started working many years and very hard and having a great business career. And that 10 years later, he died in '95. And at that time, then the family was cleaning out his house, and they opened a closet, and on the shelf, and they were full of awards for all the things that he had done all these years. So he was a very humble man, and he didn't talk about the things that he did. He didn't, and actually he let people take credit for some of the things that he did. He wasn't really worried about that. He was more worried about doing a good job and doing it well. And so I had this idea for a book for a long time, and I eventually got the opportunity to take time off from my career and do the research that was needed. I had no idea how big of a project it was when I started. So 3 years later, I've got the book finished. It's not published yet. I have an agent, and he's actively pursuing getting a publisher, so we're hopeful for that. That should happen soon. You all noticed on your seat there's a little slip of paper, and I would love for you to fill that out, not just because I want you to buy a book, which I do want you to buy a book, but at the end of the presentation tonight, we're going to collect those, and then I'm going to do a drawing, and somebody's going to win a book when it comes out. Okay? So when you'll know, I'll say, hey, time to collect all those, and put your name in the hat, and hopefully you'll be one of the people that gets to win the book. So Kathy Speck's father, Harry Speck, was a professor at Iowa State, and he was a junior chemist on the project. And there was a quote that he also said about Dr. Wilhelm. I'm not sure exactly what he said, but he said, if Harley Wilhelm were on a deserted island in the middle of the ocean with nobody around and nothing there, he would invent a flush toilet. So Dr. Speck knew that Dr. Wilhelm was a pretty smart guy. Well, the Manhattan Project, there were many sites, 13 sites across the country that participated in a big way in the Manhattan Project. And as you can see, Los Alamos is there. Everybody's heard of Los Alamos. Everybody's heard of Oak Ridge. But who knows that anything happened in Ames? And it's smack dab in the middle of the country, and it was a very, very important part of the Manhattan Project. And I'm going to tell you all about that and how we ended up on that project. Well, if anybody recognizes this, a date which will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor's bombed. But what I bet most of you in this room don't know is that on December 6th, 1941, another very important thing happened. That was the date that President Roosevelt signed off on funding for the Manhattan Project. So the day before we bombed, he agreed to it, but scientists have been very concerned, and physicists were very concerned hearing that Germany was working on a bomb and had been trying to get the government to give money for it. Well, he finally signed off on it. After that, things started happening very fast. Arthur Compton, Nobel Prize winner, was at the University of Chicago, and he was a physicist that was put in charge of the project. And as he took charge, he started having some meetings, and they were secret meetings in Chicago with physicists that he had come in from Princeton and Columbia, Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and they were having these meetings and trying to figure out, well, we got funding for an atomic bomb project. What are we going to do? And we have this theory that Enrico Fermi has come up with, that we can have a nuclear chain reaction, but we don't know if it'll work. So we have to figure out a way to prove that this theory will actually work. And they had a few meetings in January, and then come February 22nd, they realized we actually need a chemist to help. We're all physicists, we know physics, but we don't really know that much about chemistry, so we need a chemist, and they invited a gentleman named Frank Spedding to come up to Chicago. So he went up to a meeting in Chicago on February 22nd, and they called that meeting Conference on Power Plant. That was the code word for let's build a bomb. So the meeting was entitled Conference on Power Plant. And during that meeting, it became really apparent that in order to prove their theory that a nuclear chain reaction was possible, they needed to have pure ingredients. And they decided that uranium was probably the best shot. We need pure uranium. The only problem with that is that 150 years have gone by since uranium has been discovered, and nobody's figured out how to purify it. So now they've got this major hurdle that they have to overcome to just prove their theory is going to work. And Compton wanted, he was in charge of this project, but he had people out east and out west and in Chicago. It was very unwieldy for him to have to try and coordinate all that, so he decided, we're going to do this in Chicago. They created the metallurgical laboratory in Chicago, and which they nicknamed the Met Lab, and that was kind of code also, because the university had already been planning to have a metallurgical laboratory, and so they just used that name, and no, they thought the enemy would never figure it out, that what they were working on in Chicago. Well, Frank Spedding's at this meeting. They've made the decision they're going to have the Met Lab in Chicago. But as they're talking, they come to realize, you know, we really need somebody that knows things about metals. And so we need a metallurgist. And we also, Compton had, they realized to work with metals, you need to have a high an induction furnace. It has high temperatures, so you can melt the metal in there and not have explosions and bad things happen. And he had one on order, but it wasn't going to come for several months. Frank Spedding says, hey, I know a metallurgist, and I have a whole team of people down at Ames that can work on this, and we have a furnace. So we'll go down there and we'll work on it for you. We'll work on it in Ames. Well, that whole team of people was one person, and that was Dr. Wilhelm. He had one person on his staff that knew physical chemistry. For Spedding, you know, he kind of exaggerated a little bit. People, you know, there's stories about, you know, he was kind of the front man and went out and told the story and got the money coming in. It was very important in regards to that. But he tended to exaggerate a little bit. So Compton doesn't know otherwise, so he says, sure, you know, we'll do that. If you've got metallurgists down there and a whole team of people, let's move it down to Ames, and you can do this initial work. So now I'm getting ahead of myself, so I need to see where I'm at. All right. So, but that's going to be temporary. And Spedding is put in charge of the whole chemistry project. He moves up to Ames, joins a country club, gets really busy up there organizing the chemistry part. He does come home on weekends, but Wilhelm is down in Ames starting to work on it. But their main assignment was to find a substitute for uranium. They decided they needed uranium, but this whole team, made up of Eugene Wigner and Enrico Fermi and Arthur Compton and many big names in physics, didn't believe they were going to get the pure uranium they needed. So they thought, let's find a substitute. We got Berkeley and Westinghouse and Princeton and Columbia. They're all working on finding pure uranium. Let's have Ames look for a substitute. So that was the original job for the Ames team, was to try and find a substitute for uranium. So they get busy down here. Wilhelm recruits a doctoral candidate to work for him and an undergrad. So now he's got a team of 3 to work on this. And they start doing some experiments. There are many things that they have to figure out. And it was pretty freewheeling and lax back in those days in terms of security. And a story that I like to tell because it really does show how things are different than they are today, back then, is that Dr. Wilhelm used to do some babysitting duties for his wife. And she wanted to go off and do shopping. He'd bring the kids down to the laboratory. And one day he's in his office, and he's working on his office, and his daughter, Myrna, is in the office. And there's a safe in the office that's got all the classified documents and secret documents on the project. He's busy. He turns around, and the safe is open. And he's like, how did you get that open? Well, Dad, I just used my gym locker combination. So, shortly after that, a wall went up in the chemistry building to keep the kids out and keep anybody out that shouldn't be in there. They posted an armed guard, a guard with a gun outside the door to keep the kids out and the enemy out. Yeah, things are different nowadays. Let's see here. He starts working on this process for substitute for uranium. But he says to himself, you know what? Those physicists, they really want uranium. They don't want a substitute. They really believe uranium is going to work. So I'm going to work on that on the side. And he starts doing experiments, a whole other chain of experiments on the side to work on purifying uranium while he's working on these substitutes. In his investigations, he learned of two processes that were being used to try and purify uranium. One of them was at Westinghouse. And they used uranium tetrafluoride, which is called green salt, because it has the consistency of salt, and it's green, and that's what it looks like. And they had a process, Westinghouse had developed a process that they could get some almost pure uranium. It was about 65–70% pure, not really pure. But when they produced it, they would get about something the size of a grain of rice. And they took this uranium tetrafluoride, they put it in a sodium chloride bath in big vats, and they carried it up to the roof of the building in New Jersey and put it out there because it was a photoelectric process that required the sun to hit it. Now, we're talking January, February, March in New Jersey, and you're not getting a lot of sunlight. So that didn't go very well. It was really inefficient. But Compton didn't have any other choice, so he signed a contract for them to produce 100 pounds a week for $1,000 a pound. And that was pretty steep, but that's the best he could get. But he was not sure that was going to produce enough uranium. And Wilhelm, so he knew this uranium tetrafluoride worked when it was in this bath, but not really good, but it was a potential ingredient that material he could use later on when he started doing his own purification experiments. So that's Westinghouse. So that basically gets ruled out. A company named Metal Hydrides, they combine metals, and that's kind of their specialty. And they had a process that was pretty good too, 65–70% pure. It made kind of like little pellets, and they would melt them and they put them in these cans. The problem with it was explosive. People were getting hurt, injured, and Dr. Wilhelm was like, I don't want my people getting hurt. I don't think that's a very good process. In fact, this is just not the actual truck, but there was an instance where they were transporting some of the metal hydrides uranium to Columbia University in a semi, and the whole thing went up in flames. So that was a really dangerous method, and he ruled that one out. I'm not going to do that method either. Looking for a substitute. So a couple things, I won't go into a lot of detail, and it's really hard because I wrote a whole book, and now I'm going to try and figure out what I can say to you that's not going to make you fall asleep, number one, and number two, that isn't too technical. But two different things he was looking at: uranium dioxide, and it wasn't the best. And I like to show this picture because Fiesta ware has uranium dioxide. In the 30s and 40s, they used that as a coloration for dishes. And so if you have any dishes in the 30s and 40s that are Fiesta ware or any ceramics that are that color, they're radioactive still today, and you shouldn't be eating off them. They look nice on the shelf, but you don't want to be eating off them. So that was one thing he was looking at. The other one was uranium carbide. And he did experiments with uranium carbide, and he would take the ingredients and put it in a crucible, which was a graphite container that they would put things in and try and melt it. And it melted into metal, but then when it hardened, it stuck to the crucible, and they couldn't get it apart. They had to break the crucible and break the carbide, so that didn't work. And on top of that, it turned out that uranium carbide just kind of dissipates into the air, and so within a week, everything that they had was going to disappear. So that was ruled out. So he had all these things he was trying, and to find the substitute. But he says, I'm going to keep trying to find the actual way of purifying uranium. Also, I just like to tell this story because it's kind of interesting or cute, is that this is all highly classified. Early on, we only had a few workers, and you could, they all had to sign their secrecy documents. They're not going to commit treason. And Dr. Wilhelm decided, I have to stop sleeping with my wife. Okay, well, I need to get into a different bedroom because I talk in my sleep. I might give away classified secrets if I'm sleeping in the same bedroom. So he moved into the other bedroom in the house for the remainder of the project, since he didn't want to give away any secrets. Plus, if his family knew anything, they could be in danger from spies. So they had many problems that he needed to solve. Nobody had really done any research on uranium. As I said, 150 years earlier, uranium was discovered, but they didn't know how to purify it. Well, if you don't know anything, you don't know the chemical properties. Does it react with water? Does it react with air? Does it? Can you put it in a container and have it not stick to it? Can you? How do you cast it? If we get the metal, how are we going to shape? How are we going to cast it into the form we want? All these things he was trying to figure out. They didn't even know the melting point of uranium. The papers said 1800 degrees. Well, they thought it was 1800 degrees because uranium was always in a compound, and it was melting at whatever temperature the melting point of the compound ingredient was. Once he finally purified uranium, he realized and discovered that it was 1,132 degrees is the melting point of uranium. So he had all kinds of problems he was trying to work out. And through the summer, he also, we're into the summer of 42, and they are trying to come up with ways to cool the reactors. So in Oak Ridge, they're going to have this giant reactor, and they knew they needed to cool the reactor. And the things that they were looking at were water, mercury, and lead in a molten form. And Wilhelm was assigned the task of investigating lead. And he spent many experiments and many hours working with lead and melting it and seeing what they could put it in. And one of the things that was in the pile for the reactors was graphite. Well, this fluid was going to be going around the graphite, and the problem with lead, it turned out, he learned, is that it permeates the graphite. So he was able to tell them, you're not going to be able to use lead, go with water. So they actually ended up using water, as I think a lot of you know if you've read anything on the Manhattan Project. So the summer of 42, he's working on that. He's trying to figure out how to cast. He has a gentleman named C.F. Gray, who was a PhD. He had been one of his PhD students that's working for him, working on casting. They're working on the purification. Dr. Keller is working on the purification with them. He has some undergraduate students working for him. They decided to look at aluminum as a potential metal to try and do, and I'm not sure what the compound was, but aluminum that they would use and try and pull the uranium out of uranium oxide. And they did many experiments with that to no avail. Didn't work. A lot of failure. When you're a scientist, I've learned. By the way, my disclaimer, I had one chemistry class in high school. and so it's been a big journey going and reading these original documents from 1942 that were written very sloppily by these scientists and trying to translate them, discern what they say, then translate them, and then convert them into layperson's terms that I could understand. So that's my disclaimer. If I say anything that's not technically right, I have an out. He was working on aluminum. Aluminum didn't work all summer long. But then he remembered those things at Westinghouse. And that uranium tetrafluoride worked to some degree with Westinghouse. And he and Spedding talked about it. And they're like, can we get our hands on some uranium tetrafluoride? If we get that here, maybe we can figure out a way to do it in a thermite reduction process. And Spedding was able to get his hands on some in Chicago, and he brought it back, and they ended up having a very important experiment. And I call it the breakthrough moment, because that's when they purified the very first uranium. So you don't have to read this. Don't even try to read it. But I have this up here because this is the list of experiment research lines that he had just for the month of August. There's 16 different whole list of experiment lines, and each one of those has many experiments behind it. He had all that going on, plus he was overseeing the analytical part. So he's doing the physical chemistry part and overseeing the analytical part for SPEDing. And mind you, he didn't have an operations management degree, he had a chemistry degree. And now he's got all these people working for him, doing all these experiments, trying to keep track of all this stuff. I mean, it boggles my mind that he just was able to step into this and figure out what needed to be done, what experiments they needed to do, what ingredients they needed, how many people they needed, and sourcing everything they needed to do them. In August of 42 is when this uranium tetrafluoride showed up, and that was exciting. They had a thing called a bomb. Now, not the bomb, a bomb, and that was a steel pipe about this big that they used to conduct the fateful experiment in. It had a metal flange welded on the bottom, and it had a top that was screwed on, and inside it, they put the uranium tetrafluoride and calcium. And Gerald Butler and Wayne Keller, Gerald Butler was an undergraduate student working on the project, and Wayne Keller was a PhD working with Wilhelm, working under Wilhelm for the project, and Dr. Wilhelm came up with this experiment. And they put the materials inside this bomb, they close it up, and they want to trigger it, but they don't know what's going to happen. Okay, so we don't want to do this in the building. They take it outside, they go to the courtyard outside the chemistry building, which is Gilman Hall now. It was called the Chem building back then, but now it's Gilman Hall. And they put it in the courtyard, and Dr. Wilhelm thinks how am I going to trigger this? Because it's a heat reaction. I need heat to get the reaction to go. And he uses a spark plug. And he gets that, but the guys, they run around the corner of the building to watch and see what happens, because they don't know if it's going to explode or not. And they're watching, and they see the bomb. They call it a bomb because they used to explode a lot. They call it a bomb. So it was made out of steel, and it had a lot of bad things happen with bombs. The top would fly off. They'd have fires in the building because they'd go through into the attic and catch the corn walls on fire, and all kinds of crazy things were happening. But they had this bomb, they did their reaction, it shook and settled down. Now remember when I said how hot uranium gets? They couldn't just go over and walk over there and open it up and say it worked, because it was pretty hot. So that was on August 3rd, and they had to wait until it cooled down. August 5th, which happened to be Dr. Wilhelm's 42nd birthday, they opened that up, and inside was a mass. It wasn't a mass of uranium. It was a mass of byproducts. And they didn't see any uranium, so they took it and they clumped it, got it out, and kind of looked at it. They didn't see any uranium. They decided, let's take a saw and cut it in half. So they cut it in half, and in there they spied it. The first pure uranium. 20 grams, teeny weeny, 3 millimeters in diameter. But that little tiny piece of uranium was about to change world history. And so now he's like, I can do it. It's August 5th, it's his birthday. He writes up a report, but it ends up in the August 15th report. And this is, the red here is what's highlighted, is that actual experiment and the results, and it's all on file at the University Archives. So he sends the report in, and that's August 15th. But he decides that I need to see if I can scale this up, because we need a lot more than 20 grams of uranium. They had a plan to conduct the first nuclear chain reaction, controlled nuclear chain reaction, on December 2nd, 1942 in Chicago, and that was scheduled. But nobody knew how to purify uranium yet. They needed all this pure uranium. Wilhelm now had 20 grams, and decides they're going to start scaling it up. So he works on changing the ratios of the different materials in the bombs, and starts getting a little bit bigger quantities each time he does it. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, he accumulates a whole bunch of little pebbles and pieces, and they're now kind of they're throwing them in a box or something, and about September 22nd, he says, you know what? I know I can do this. I have to show Compton. I have to show Compton that I know how to scale up production of uranium. I know how to purify it. So he asks C.F. Gray, who was that PhD student, or PhD that worked for him. He had been his PhD student, but he was graduated by then. He had him cast all that into one ingot. And that ingot, when it was all combined, 6 weeks of work, was 11 pounds, and it was about this big, 6 inches by about 1.5 inches in diameter. All those many, many experiments working 24 hours a day, they got this 11 pounds, but it was the most and only pure uranium on the planet. He had them melt it all down, and he's going to take the midnight train to Chicago. So he can't wait for this to cool down any longer. It's still hot. He grabs it, puts it in his 20-year-old briefcase that was a gift to him from students many years earlier, and bolts to the train station, gets on the sleeper car, takes the overnight train to Chicago. When he gets in Chicago, he starts walking across campus, carrying his briefcase, and the handle breaks. So here he's carrying this invaluable piece of uranium in this old briefcase. No guards, nobody's protecting him. I've since calculated what that uranium in today's dollars are worth. $40 million. So, things were just different back then. So he ends up going into find Spedding. Spedding is in Chicago. And they find Spedding. Whoops. No, I'll go back. He goes and finds Spedding, and they want to go and show Arthur Compton this ingot of uranium. They walk in the door. Wilhelm takes his briefcase, he opens it up, and he puts this on the desk in front of Compton. Compton's eyes bugged out, and his jaw dropped. He'd never seen anything like it. He didn't believe it was real. He didn't believe it was pure, and he didn't believe it was solid, and he made Wilhelm prove it. So they took that ingot of uranium down to the shop and decided to cut it in two. The reason Compton didn't believe it was solid is because when metals cool, they form a vacuum or a pipe on the inside, like a void on the inside as they cool. And so Compton just assumed that it had to have a void. Well, what he didn't know is that Wilhelm also, in July and August, was inventing a process for cooling metals so there wouldn't be a pipe. So he invented another process in the meantime with the pipes. I mean, it blows my mind when I think about all the stuff he was thinking about nonstop. In fact, he thought all the time. He'd come home for lunch during the day, and he'd listen to his favorite radio newscaster. I think his name is Jack Shelley, really, right? Very popular. He'd come in and listen to him, and then he'd take a little afternoon nap. And his oldest daughter, Lorna, used to chime in like, "You are so lazy, taking a nap in the middle of the day." And he'd say, "I'm thinking." And you know what? He was. He was thinking. So they've got this uranium pipe, not solid uranium. They cut it in two. Well, a fire breaks out when they cut it in two, because nobody's ever cut uranium before, because they never had it before. Fire breaks out. Wilhelm runs over to the side, grabs the fire extinguisher, goes over to put out the fire. It's empty. The extinguisher is empty. So one of the workers ran over and grabbed the other fire extinguisher, which was not empty, and they put the fire out. It proved it was solid. Then they tested it for purity, and by gosh, it was pure. Compton said, "Hold everything. That furnace we have coming to Chicago, send it to Ames. They know how to produce pure uranium in quantities." They have 11 pounds. Now, for this experiment that they have coming up in December, they need 6,000 pounds of uranium. So it's September 23rd. We've gone from 20 grams to 11 pounds, and he's got another 6 weeks or so or maybe more than that, 2.5 months, to come up with 6,000 pounds. Well, they still don't think it's going to happen. He starts working on another method. So the first method, he's got uranium tetrafluoride with calcium, and he knows he can ramp that up. But calcium's hard to get, and it's very expensive. He'd taken the cost of producing the uranium down from that $1,000 a pound that Compton was paying from Westinghouse, that wasn't even pure, to $22 using the calcium. But he also thought, maybe I can do it a little bit cheaper. My grandfather was known for really being frugal, hence the 20-year-old briefcase, right? So he started experimenting with magnesium and working on that while he was producing all this uranium for the Chicago experiment. And eventually was able to get that process to work really well also. And when he was finished with that process, he had gotten it down to $1 a pound to produce uranium. Pretty amazing. So they're working on ramping all this up in time for this Chicago experiment. They start shipping it to Chicago. They're not going to have 6,000 pounds in time for that experiment. So Compton says, well, we've got 2,000 pounds that's pure. Let's put that in the center of the pile that we're building. And we'll use the impure uranium from the other places and put that on the outside. He believed that if he could get that chain reaction going from the initial center, that maybe it would continue when it got to the outer layers. That was the impure uranium. So the Ames uranium was at the center of the pile. It was the core of the pile. There were some other challenges that he had. As I mentioned, he had the bomb, and they could see it shaking, but it was a thermite reaction, and they really didn't know when that was starting and it was ending. And if he could figure out that, he could reduce the time that it took to do the process. And so he thought, I'll invent a hearing device that I can attach to these bombs, and then we can hear when it starts and when it ends. And he got another patent on that too. So that's a copy of the patent. This up here is borax. Did anybody ever use borax when they were growing up? So boron is in borax, and in uranium and in a nuclear chain reaction, they believed that it would be an impurity that would kill the reaction. And so they needed to remove all the boron in the area so it didn't get into the uranium. That meant that all the flasks, the cleaning ingredients for the flasks and the workbenches, everything, they had to get cleaning things that didn't have boron in them. And the workers had their work clothes that were provided by the project, but they were filled with uranium dust, so they weren't allowed to go home, carrying uranium dust home with them. So they left that behind and laundered them on site. But the laundry detergent had boron in it, so they had to swap that out for a boron-free variety. Wilhelm was really good at that. He went through, and he and his workers figured out where all the boron was, got that out, so they didn't have problems except for one time. Somehow, boron got into their uranium. It was after the big chain reaction, it was later on. And they did some analysis, and they finally figured out that a newer worker had brought in some little cleaning thing to clean his shoes, and it was ruining their uranium. But they figured it out, they got rid of it. And they didn't get rid of him, but they got rid of the boron. So he had all kinds of different things that he was doing, trying to figure out, and it just kind of blows my mind when I think about it. All right, so the big day comes. December 2nd, 1942. We're going to have chain reaction. We hope. Okay? It's all theory right now. So Wilhelm and Spedding are going to Chicago. But Wilhelm didn't go there. He went somewhere else. Spedding got off the train, and he went there. And actually, in this drawing, he's up there. I'm not sure which one he is. I can't remember. Anyway, maybe one of you can Edith, can you recognize him? Right there? Okay, great. So Frank Spedding was there. Nobel Prize winners, really big names, and he was part of history. How exciting is that? Wilhelm, for two reasons, did not go to Chicago for that purpose. The first was, he didn't know what was going to happen that day. They didn't know if Chicago was going to blow up or not. And the physicist, he's like, it's their deal. I'll let them have their experiment. I don't need to be there for that in case something doesn't work the way they expect. But the other reason was that he wanted to go to Saginaw, Michigan. So he took a train to Saginaw, Michigan, and in his suitcase he carried these great big cabbage-sized pieces of magnesium that they needed to cut down and break down so that they could continue to break it down into a powder that they could then use in this new method that he had invented with the magnesium. So he was going to look at what was called a garbage hog, because it could chew up anything. They would throw in shoes and all kinds of stuff and it would chew it up. And he figured maybe that would chew up his magnesium. And sure enough it did. He ordered it and that eventually got delivered. So he opted out that day, but Chicago didn't blow up, so it all turned out good. All right, whoops. So they're shipping a lot of materials from Iowa State. After the experiment happens, the production really goes up. So in January of 43, a contract is signed by Spedding that says we will produce 100 pounds a day of pure uranium. Now, it took him 2.5 months to get 2,000 pounds, but he commits to 100 pounds a day in January. But every week that goes up. And by March, he had committed to doing 1,000 pounds a day. And so Wilhelm and his team are chugging along like crazy, and they never missed a single production goal. Very big deal. They hit every single goal. He just kept figuring out how to improve the process and reduce the waste and all these things. During the production process of uranium, you create a lot of waste. And in that waste is some uranium that's kind of lost in the process. Well, it's very valuable during the war when every piece of uranium, and they even confiscated all the uranium from the dish makers because they needed that uranium for the war, so Fiestaware and stuff wasn't being produced, at least bread wasn't, during the war. And so they needed to recapture that. All this waste is being produced in Ames, and the government says, we want you to ship this east. We'll store it here until we figure out a process to reclaim that uranium. And Wilhelm's like, well, what am I going to put this stuff in to ship it? Well, one of his people, Wayne Keller, says, I'm from Kentucky and they make whiskey down there, and there's whiskey barrels that they use them one time and then they throw them out. We could get some of those on the cheap. We could get those on the cheap. So they end up ordering the whiskey barrels, much to the chagrin of the purchasing department at Iowa State, who actually got the purchase order was for actual barrels of whiskey, and which that got explained. No, it's just the whiskey barrels. There's no whiskey in them, and the president of the university says whatever Wilhelm wants, get him. Of course, Wilhelm was a teetotaler. He never had a drink in his day, so whiskey was not really up his alley. But those whiskey barrels would come in, and he discovered that all kinds of volunteers were showing up to unload the whiskey barrels. And it turned out that inside the barrel was a filter that happened to absorb a little bit of whiskey, and they figured out they tilted just the right way, they could get about a cup of whiskey out of there. And I have it on good authority that Ray Fisher and several of the other guys, James Eileth, that were living together, at one point had 12 gallons of whiskey in their apartment. So there were some good times to be had during the project, too. So they ended up shipping all this waste material out east. Well, eventually, he's got his process going really well for producing all the uranium, and the government comes to him and says, can you figure out a way to recapture that uranium and all that waste? So they start shipping it back. And he invents a process that then takes that uranium that's been lost and reclaims it, and they're able to use that. And just through that process, the Ames team produced 450,000 pounds of uranium. So all said and told during the project, Ames, who came up with this 20-gram piece, in 3 years produced 2 million pounds of pure uranium. That was then sent to, most of it went to Oak Ridge, some went to Hanford, and some went down to Los Alamos. So really important, big things were happening. Fateful day. August 6th, 1945. But you know what? In the US, it was August 5th, and that was his 45th birthday. Kaboom! What a celebration. This was so classified and secret, and all the workers couldn't talk about it with their families. Harley's wife, Orpha, didn't know what he was working on. And they knew that the bomb had been dropped, and they turned the radio on, and they were waiting for the announcement. And they heard it. Dr. Wilhelm called home and said, Orpha, turn on the radio. You'll know what I've been doing the last 3 years. Pretty big. So then, they're all gathered around. They hear Secretary of War Stimson's going to come on the radio and talk about how this came about. And he mentions some of the facilities involved. And there was Columbia and Princeton and UC Berkeley and Iowa State. The little guys. Iowa State. And the whole building just erupted in cheers. They were so proud. And now they could tell people, I'm not a draft dodger. I was actually working on the war effort. And so it was a big thing. And they produced so much uranium, but it was all classified, and nobody knew anything about it. During the war, there was an award called the Army-Navy E-Flag. And that was given to industry. If they hit their production, they got this big flag, lots of pomp and circumstance, government agents, people would come in, all the employees got a little flag, Army-Navy E-Flag pin, and the company would proudly put it up on their flagpole. Well, Iowa State was in production, but they were an educational institution, so they didn't get this flag. However, the war ends October 12th, 1945. General Groves, who is this gentleman here, who had been put in charge for the government, the entire project, came to Ames, and at the gymnasium at the university, they did the Army-Navy E-Flag Award, and they got the big flag with all the stars because they hit every single production goal that they were given. Big deal. All the employees, and of course the arrow there's my grandpa, right there under the arrow, and there's Dr. Spetty next to him. And they flew it. They flew it here on campus for about 3 years. It's very tattered because it was in all the weather, and they've got it on display in Spedding Hall. So that's pretty cool. But what's really neat in my mind is that, unbeknownst to Spedding, General Groves gave Dr. Wilhelm his own flag. And as far as we know, he's the only individual in the project to have received the Army-Navy E-Flag. Wilhelm was a humble guy, though. He took that flag home and he put it in his closet. He put it in his closet. He didn't tell Spedding about it. But it wasn't until after Spedding died that he brought it out. And this is a picture of him and my grandmother in 1985 at the American Chemistry Society meeting in Iowa, where he displayed it for the first time. We have it in the family. It's in mint condition. All right, so this brilliant scientist, where did he come from? Well, this is him. He's about 6 years old, and this is his original schoolhouse called Pumptown School. The book is called The Boy from Pumptown. That's a working title. The publisher might change the title, but the working title is The Boy from Pumptown. One-room schoolhouse. And in a one-room schoolhouse, you have the different ages of the children sitting from youngest to eldest towards the back. The youngest in front, eldest at the back. In front of the youngest is a recitation bench, and when it's your turn, your age group, to be taught, you go and you sit on the bench and you have instruction. Well, at Pumptown School, he only went there for 2 years, but that was when people kind of figured out he was pretty smart. He was sitting in his bench, he was in second grade at the time, or at his desk, and in front of him were the fourth graders. And one little boy just wasn't getting it. He wasn't getting the math. And Harley was sitting in, and he's like, well, this is really easy. I don't understand why he's not getting that. He must be daydreaming about squirrel hunting. And that's literally what he told us that he thought as a little second grader. So he was figuring out fourth grade math in second grade in his one-room schoolhouse. Now, Pumptown School, he never knew why it was called that because Pumptown School was not in Pumptown. There was no Pumptown. There was no town. It was out in the country. And there was no pump. So the kids walk a half mile to go get water for the school for the day. So he never knew why they called it Pumptown School. Okay, 1912, basketball finally makes it to Elston, Iowa. Elston is the little town that his farm is outside of. He was growing up in southern Iowa, in Ringgold County, one of the poorest counties in Iowa. And it comes to Elston, he learns to play basketball, he really likes it, the boys want to play. They don't have a gym, they play on the grass. But he starts learning and he gets pretty good. And by 8th grade, he's good enough that he's a substitute on the high school team. So now he's going to the Elston School, which is a little bit bigger. There he is in the front. He's 15 years old there, curly blonde hair, blue eyes. I didn't get that. I got straight hair. But he's pretty good, and he ends up being invited to be a substitute on the high school team. And they take him along, and they're in a game, and I don't know which game it was, but I know the story. So they play this game, and the coach says, it's near the end of the game, he says, get in there and score a basket. So he goes running in there, he gets the ball, he gets cornered, he can't get to the basket. Time's running out. So he turns around with his back to the basket, takes the ball, throws it, in it goes! They win the game! From that day forward, he was on the team. He wasn't a substitute anymore. So now, he's in high school, and he's on the team, and his high school, Elfton School, really small. It's an unaccredited high school. Probably not a real good high school, it's unaccredited. And he has a big graduating class of 11, and he's a co-valedictorian when he finally graduates. But he's learning how to play basketball, and the team's pretty good, and sports writers start kind of following him. And they end up going to a tournament, a Ringgold County tournament, where Drake University coach is the referee. And here's this kid like zipping all over the place, making baskets like crazy. He's like, who is this kid? We got to get him to go to Drake. And then Wilhelm, with his math expertise, takes the ball, throws it at the ceiling, hits the ceiling, gets the angle right, it goes in the basket. It's like, we're going to get this kid to come up to Drake. We need him on our team. They recruit him to go to Drake. And he didn't have any money, he was broke. He was a sharecropper son, came from extremely humble beginnings. His dad never owned his own farm. And ends up going to Drake. But they're pretty sure he's going to flunk out, unaccredited high school. How can he possibly be smart enough to pass? Well, they say you have to take entrance exams to prove that you're going to succeed. Well, he goes to take the entrance exams, and there's a proctor who's going to oversee to make sure he doesn't cheat. And this proctor's name is Orpha, and she thinks he's pretty cute. Muscular from working on the farm, blue eyes, curly blonde hair. He takes those exams, she sees the scores, and he's pretty smart too. So they became fast friends, and Dr. Wilhelm, who wasn't a doctor, I call him Dr. Wilhelm, Grandpappy, we call him, he did a lot of odd jobs to pay for college. He had a scholarship, but he didn't pay for anything. He did odd jobs, he washed dishes, did a variety of different things. One of them was to deliver mail in the registrar's office. How convenient, given that Orpha worked in the registrar's office. And he was also known for being late a lot, which drove us and the family nuts. But it endeared him to Orpha in their early years, and she got over it, and he would come racing, and he had this job of delivering the mail in the registrar's office for all the professors, but he was running late for class all the time, so he'd come in and he's trying to get it done. Oh, I'll do it for you, Harley. So Orpha she got in trouble because she was doing his job. But they became fast friends, and eventually they got married, and she became my grandma. Well, at Drake, he was this athlete. He was really good in high school. He became known as the Tornado. Incredible. He zipped all over the place, and he eventually became the captain for the basketball team at Drake. And when he was on the team, Drake set a win-loss record that held for 45 years. That's pretty cool. He was really good. Couple instances. Back in the 20s, games didn't go very high. Maybe 30 points was a really good game in basketball. They didn't have 100-point games like they do now. And they played against Washington University, and they won 29-0. And Harley scored every point. Unbelievable. He was so good. And but he was still a humble guy. There was another game where it was down to the final shot to win the game, and it was in Des Moines. The Des Moines Register was there, and Harley scored the final shot. They won the game, but the reporter gave credit to the captain of the team that year. He was a junior at the time. To the captain, and Harley didn't say anything about it. And people were like, doesn't that bother you? He was like, no. Every basket counts. My basket just happened to be the last basket, but we needed every basket to win the game. So he was really into crediting people for, it was a team effort. It wasn't just about Harley. He graduates, and he decides he's going to be a coach. teacher and coach, teach math or science, and he gets a job in Mapleton. He teaches there for a year, saves up money, goes to Drake University for a year of graduate school, runs out of money, goes and teaches for a year at Guthrie Center, has a pretty good year, and says, I think I will be a coach. That's going to be my career path. So he gets a job at Intermountain Union College out in Helena, Montana. And he packs up Orpha and their new baby Lorna in July. She'd just been born like 3 weeks earlier. Packs her up, all their worldly belongings in their 1926 Ford, and head out to Montana. And that's their Ford. And they had some car trouble, because you know the roads weren't very developed back in the 1920s. There were no interstates, there were no highways, it was very rocky, and they had a lot of flat tires, and here he is changing the tire. And so it was a pretty rough ride out there. He gets out there, and he's going to be the coach for basketball, football, and track, and teach science. Great. This little college is a step up from high school. However, when the boys show up for football practice, none of them had ever played football before. He had a team that never played football. So they lost every game. It was terrible. Basketball season, that's his sport. He's going to do well with that. Only problem is, they don't have a gymnasium. He has no place to play. So he's teaching them how to play on paper. He's drawing diagrams, do this, and jump there, and tries to teach them how to play basketball. Well, the season opens, and he's still, well, I think we'll do okay. We'll probably still do okay. Well, a spinal meningitis outbreak happens, and the health department shuts down all the public events. So his first half of the season is canceled. So his team, they don't have a place to practice. None of them got sick, but they didn't get to play. Season ends up, the first half is over, they go to play, and they lose every game. And it dawns on him, I'm not going to be a coach. I think I'm going to go get my PhD. And he writes a letter to Dr. Coover at Iowa State to see if he can get a job as a graduate assistant, and he does. And so he packs up his wife and baby, and they move back to Iowa. Okay, Iowa State. So he was pretty much teaching most of the time. He was doing a little bit of research. He got his PhD, and I can never pronounce it, so I'm not going to. You can always Google it and find it. But it was more words that I can't really say very well. But one thing happened that was pretty notable in his career. It was in the early 30s. And it turned out that in Ankeny, the children's teeth were being mottled, meaning gray and brown and just really icky looking. And they wanted to figure out why that was happening. Well, at the time, the University of Iowa is where the health department was at, and they didn't figure it out. So there was a professor at Iowa State that wanted to figure it out, and he asked Dr. Wilhelm if he would help. And Dr. Wilhelm said yes, and he got a sample of water, and he examined the water, and he discovered that it was an overabundance of fluoride in the water that was creating this problem with the teeth. That hit the newspaper, and the University of Iowa wasn't very happy because Iowa State figured it out. So then the Manhattan Project came along. I've already talked about that. The Manhattan Project ends up being so successful at Iowa State. Frank Spedding envisions creating a national laboratory, and he recruits Wilhelm to help with the whole concept. And they go to the government. They convince them to fund them to build 2 buildings, the metallurgy building and the chemistry building, which both eventually get renamed Wilhelm Hall and Spedding Hall. Ames Laboratory, there's at least one professor in here. Anybody else in here that worked at Ames Laboratory? Raise your hand if you did. Great. I know you learned a lot of good stuff there, or else you taught a lot of good stuff there. World-renowned, wonderful institution, world experts in uranium, thorium, rare earth metals, all kinds of metals, critical materials, energy, high-speed computing, all kinds of things that really put, even Iowa State was a very good agricultural school and engineering school. They were known for that, but boy, Ames Lab raised the bar, really raised the bar. And this community can be really proud because they produce a wonderful organization. There's about a total of 500 people who work at Ames Lab right now, and I think the budget is 40 or 50 million. It's a really great organization. Dr. Wilhelm, this is later in his life, in his 60s, I think. If you look at the side of her tie, you should tell about what era it is. And in his career at Iowa State, he had more patents than any other person at Iowa State for over 40 years. He had 40 patents in chemistry and 60 patents relating to, in chemistry and metallurgy, and 60 patents relating to atomic energy. I mean, yeah. So he really brought a lot along to the world. And he was an expert on uranium, but he was also a world expert on thorium. And he invented the mass production process for thorium, and he was involved in the mass production for cerium and vanadium, I can't say it well, all these weird metals. And he actually wrote a whole book on thorium. Who does that? He also, when nuclear reactors were coming into vogue for nuclear energy, they were having a problem with corrosion, the water corroding, and they were worried the radioactive water was going to get out. And they came to him and asked him if he could invent something else, and he did. He invented a new alloy called Zirc alloy that they used to line nuclear reactors with, and they still do to this day use that alloy. He also was a representative for the U.S. government at the atomic, the International Conference on Peaceful Uses of Atomic Energy. He was U.S. delegate. I went there, I was in 1955, and it was a little controversial, even though he had been approved, because it was time to share the secret of how to purify uranium, so that other countries could benefit with the processes for nuclear power and for nuclear medicine and things that were coming down the pipe. And he went and presented on that. And it just so happens that day my dad was driving home from work, and he heard on the radio, and Paul Harvey was saying, that Wilhelm is over in Switzerland giving away our secrets on how to purify uranium. But it was all approved. So he was so impactful in so many ways. And I think about today. So now this is an article that came up just a few weeks ago, and it's safer thorium reactor trials could salvage nuclear power. They're looking at thorium. Well, he was the world expert. He did all this initial work on thorium. And now they're looking at using it as a replacement for uranium. And I think I can say, now my grandpa maybe had a little bit to do with that too. And then we're not back in the 70s, we had the Voyager flights that took off. I was a teenager, a late teenager, and it took 40 years, but they finally left the solar system. And those were powered by plutonium. And plutonium is derived from pure uranium. And so I can say, you know, my grandpa had something to do with sending out a message of peace and friendship to the universe. Because that was a message that was put on the Voyagers. And so that is really the boy from hometown. He came from humble beginnings, you know, was a smart kid, good athlete, high moral code, very ethical, well-loved, and brilliant, and contributed greatly to our world today, and that is who he was. My grandpa, that's him at about 13 years old. So, a couple things now. We have a little surprise. Remember I mentioned that flag that my grandfather won? We happen to have it here with us today, and his 4 adult children that are now quite elderly themselves are going to get up and show the flag. Well, I mean, it's been over 70 years. So this is the Army-Navy E flag that Dr. Wilhelm was awarded after World War II in October of 45. Isn't that awesome? She's the one who chided him for being in bed. This is my dad, Max. He was also a basketball player, and his high school basketball team won state. And this is Myrna, the one who broke the safe. And question when she was just a little girl during that whole time. Okay. Okay. So my dad is insisting I tell you a couple things about Drake, because he was a pretty smart kid. I mean, he was this athlete, amazing athlete. And they thought he was going to flunk out, but he passed those exams, entrance exams. And when he was growing up at Pumptown School and Elliston School, they used to have the kids come up to the board and write on the board, solve the problems. That was just part of the daily exercise. Well, one day in, I think it was a physics class, the regular physics professor was out, and Dr. Morehouse, who was the dean at the time at Drake, the men's dean at Drake, was substituting. And he got stuck on this problem. And Harley got up and walked to the board and solved the problem for him. And he's like, what's going on? Well, that's just what he did. He didn't think anything of it. Another interesting thing is that for about 20 years, Drake administrative people had been trying to get Phi Beta Kappa to come onto campus. And there were some scandals, and there's a lot of struggles, and it just was never happening. But coincidentally, it happened when Wilhelm was graduating in the spring of 1923. Phi Beta Kappa came on campus, and he was a charter member at Drake. So he did well. In fact, he did good. He did good. So I guess we're going to open it up for some questions. And then if you want to also, if you're interested in the book or getting in the drawing, pass your little slips to the middle, and we'll collect those. And then when we're done doing the questions, we'll do a little drawing and see who wins the book when it comes out. That's a great question. The question is, how do they maintain secrecy? Well, one thing I didn't mention is that originally they were working in the chemistry building, but then as they ramped up production, they needed more space, and they found an old building on campus that was left over from World War I, and they were doing their work in there. It had windows. They ended up covering up the windows with some black stuff, and they had a guard, and the best method they had for convincing the students or the workers not to divulge anything was that if they did, they were going to the front. So that was a pretty good deterrent. And there were many students that got drafted that Frank Spedding intervened, because we needed those chemistry people, we needed those production people, intervened with the government and got them to release them from going off to war, and they were able to stay in Ames and work. Yes?
So along that same line, I'm assuming that the administration knew what was going on.
Only 2 people.
Repeat the question.
Okay. Did the administration of the university know what was going on? The president of the university did, and Dean Gaskill did. But nobody else in it was allowed to know. And the workers didn't know. Only Wilhelm and his top-tier people knew, but the production workers, and he had several hundred at their peak, did not know what they were working on until the day that bomb dropped. And that's when they knew for sure. Yes?
So what type of safety precautions did they take when they were handling all this?
Not a lot. Again, they didn't know a lot about uranium at the time, and they did end up having them wear masks, and they had them change clothes after every shift, and not let them leave the building wearing the uranium dust, because they were grinding the dust to shape it a lot of times. And so there really weren't any. They did have in the building that they had off on the edge of campus where they were doing the mass production, they had a room called the bag room. And in that room, there were these giant filtration bags, and they were sucking the air in there, trying to reclaim ground airborne uranium and suck that in. But otherwise, that was really it. They didn't have much. Yes?
I grew up kitty corner from that building off campus, on campus in the middle about now. And my parents were always worried about whether we would get it, from crossing the road. And I just was wondering if you could tell us more what that building looked like, or what they did, or how they did.
That's a great question. And what she asked is, what was that building look like? And I wish I'd put a picture in here. I thought of it last night, but it was too late. And it was just a rundown building, and it wasn't very big. It had been used as a popcorn research room kind of thing at one point. They kind of used it as a women's gym at one point, but it wasn't very big. It had a dirt floor, but they ended up putting cement in, and over time they kept adding on to it. But it was just a shoddy old building. It was made with corn wallboard, which was one of the reasons it was extremely flammable. They would have these explosions. They had a pit where they would take those bombs, and they'd take about 6 or 8 or 10 of them, and they got bigger. The bombs got bigger as they ramped up the production, so they ended up being like 3 feet long, which weighs several hundred pounds. Because remember, 11 pounds is only this big, right? So they put it in this big, and they had a pit that they put those in and had that reaction happen. And sometimes it would overheat, and the top would go off, and it'd go up in the rafters, and they'd have a fire. Well, this was all top secret, so the fire trucks would come, and they wouldn't let them in. And the workers ended up learning to be firefighters, because they had to put out fires. One time, the story goes, and it's true because my grandpa said it, is there were 6 fires in one day that they had to put out. I mean, it was crazy. And there was explosions. At one point, there was an explosion that blew out the side of the wall, but they'd had so many explosions that they finally just walked out there, picked it up, and pushed it back in. It was, oh yeah, and after that one, the secretaries didn't come back. Yes?
My dad, we lived across the street in this big old building, and if anybody in this room has a picture of that, there were 6 houses, and the first one was not a house. It was 18 stories on the first floor, and then a regular 8-foot on top. But he walked back and forth to Berkshire by this little building every day, and he figured out, he kept saying, there's something funny about those railroad cars.
That's a great thing. I didn't talk about the railroad cars. So the railroad, they were transporting the uranium by railroad. And because it's so heavy, they couldn't really put a lot on the railroad. They had, boxcars would come in the dead of night. The doors would be open, and there was nothing in there. But then they looked like they were leaving empty. And they had secret compartments that they were putting the uranium in the floor. But they appeared empty. And there would be a hobo sitting there that was really a government agent ready to kill you if you approached the train. Yes?
Teresa, adding on to that story, apparently, in order to sort of obfuscate the destination of those trains, the shipping orders were kind of scrambled so that it would be very, very difficult for anyone to tell where those trains were going. And there was a gentleman here in one of the lectures in the past that mentioned that he or his dad worked in the shipping department, and they figured out how to kind of obfuscate those orders.
Excellent.
That they couldn't tell where it was going. The other question I had is, where did the raw uranium ore come from? Where was that material coming from?
Well, the actual ore itself was coming mostly from Canada. And there was also a stash in Stanton, New Jersey. There was a gentleman, I can't remember his name right now, but he had a uranium mine over in the Belgian Congo. And before we really got into the war, he realized, for some reason, he thought uranium was going to be important. And he took all his uranium that he was mining and he shipped it to New York and put it in warehouses on Staten Island. And he didn't know who to contact in the government. He was calling all over the place trying to get somebody to listen to him. And finally they did, and then they were able to, make connection, and he sold the uranium to the government. But a lot of it came from the Belgian, or the Congo, Canada, and then there is uranium also in Colorado too. Yes?
How did they communicate with Chicago?
By telephone or FedEx, I'm not FedEx. The courier, they had, airmail. They did, but it was not. They didn't think about the secrecy. What if somebody was listening into the phones? They weren't just. And he went back and forth. Spedding was coming home on the weekend, so Spedding would be up there during the week, and he would come in to Ames on the weekend, and they would meet and talk about the things that were happening in Chicago, and he'd talk about. Wilhelm would tell them what was going on down here, and so they'd cross-pollinate the information and go back and share their information on the process, what was going on. Yes?
Did he have anything to do with that common chemistry plant that was on their names? or was that after its life?
The atomic energy plant that what?
Was running here in Ames.
Yes, yes. In the 60s, in fact, there's a video online of that ceremony where it's dedicated, and it was Spedding and Wilhelm that brought that to Ames. And it was there for about 25 years or so, and then they decommissioned it. Yeah, they used it for research. Yes?
When they ramped up the production to that high level, did they have these bombs you were talking about, and many of them, or what was it?
They had about a dozen or so, I don't know exactly, but the pit was maybe 5 feet by 4 feet and 4 feet deep. They would lower them down in there, and they just kept rotating them through. They had a lot of them that were ruined, and what would happen is they always had somebody sitting around watching, because those things were heating up, right? They were heating up to over 1,000 degrees. And if the lime that they used lime to line it, because the uranium tetrafluoride and the calcium that were going through this thermite reduction, or this process and heating up, if it touched the steel of the bomb, you'd get these red spots, because it was heating it up. And then it would break through and they'd have uranium squirting out. And so they put them in these pits, and then they would raise those up. And then eventually they figured out to make the process go faster is they sprayed them with water to cool them down more quickly so they could keep the process going. But they had it going 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. Yes?
So you talked about the furnace. So in relation to the pit, where was the
That
furnace?
became the furnace.
That was the
Yeah.
furnace.
And then inside the bomb is where the reduction process was happening.
And then what was the material that was burning in the furnace?
I think the heat was produced by fuel, like propane or something like that. I'm not positive on that, though. It wasn't coal, I know that. I would have heard about that. Yes?
Was any research done following all this, following up on people who may have developed cancer?
Yes. Good question. Yes. There was, during the war, they started taking urine samples from people and trying to detect radiation and other things. But then, many years later, people were getting sick, and there was later, not during the war, but later, there was a really bad beryllium accident that they were working with beryllium, and Norm Carlson got really sick and almost died, and he had health problems the rest of his life. But there was, these buildings became basically toxic sites. And the Little Ankeny, which is where they nicknamed the building where they were doing the production, not in the chem building, but the Little Ankeny where they were doing it, they eventually tore that down. But the grass and the dirt and everything was radioactive. They had to clean all that up. It became a Superfund site, essentially. And Wilhelm Hall, which was built after the war for Ames Laboratory, because they were still using thorium and beryllium and cerium, and sometimes things were going down the drain, and it became toxic. And so they ended up having to have basically Superfund kind of money come in and clean that up. But people did have health problems many years, and it wasn't until I think around 2000 that the US government acknowledged these health problems, and they identified certain cancers that were more common with the people who worked in Ames at Iowa State on the project, and the years after, so for decades after as well, they were being exposed to things. And the government did right. They, it was late because my grandfather died 5 years earlier, but they had remuneration for people and also paid their paid for their health care and other needs that they had. But there were several different cancers, and some of them metastasized late. Bladder cancer was one of them. And my grandfather ended up with bladder cancer, and that's what he eventually died of it, but it took 50 years for it to metastasize him. Yes?
I was down at Mary Greeley sometime this summer, and there was a table and a guy sitting there with a sign about, if you were exposed or know anything or know people, and he says they come every 2 or 3 years and set up and check, and he said they always find somebody that they didn't know about.
Yeah, because of the building, the metallurgy building was toxic for many decades, long after the war. It wasn't even built during the war, but after the war. So these people were exposed to it in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. until they figured it out and they ended up cleaning it all up. So if you've worked in that building, you have to have worked, I can't remember, it's 250 days or something, you have to have worked in that building, and then you can qualify for these benefits. It's called the Cold War Patriots, I think it's called, this organization. Yeah. Okay, where is the slips? Where are they? Okay. Any other questions? No, did everybody turn in their slip that wants to be in the, yes?
So after the war,
Yeah.
Repeat question, please.
Yeah. So go ahead, finish the question and I'll repeat it.
What was Wilhelm's stance on, what the goal of nuclear weapons was and
Yeah.
after?
Okay, that's a great question. You know, my grandfather was a very loving person. He was a Christian, and they didn't know for sure what the ramifications were going to be of the war. Number one, dropping the nuclear bomb has been the single greatest deterrent to it happening again. But he believed that it was necessary to end the war, and it was very personal. Across the street was a family, the Miller family, and Eddie Miller died on January 6, 1945. You got me. And he was in the Battle of the Bulge. I was promised I wasn't going to do this. And which just so happened to be Harley's, Dr. Wilhelm's son's 18th birthday. So now his own son may be drafted and end up going off to war. So he had an incentive to get this war to end. And that was the whole thing. End the war. Fewer people will die the sooner this war ends. It put the world at peace, he used to say. Yep. Sorry, I lost it. Almost made it. Yes?
I think one reason a lot of those people died from that, they were on a timeline to get that built for the end of the war, and a lot of the precautions were kind of thrown to the wind.
Yes. Yeah. They didn't think about it. They were just, got to get it done as fast as possible. Every day that we don't solve this, somebody else dies in battle. Yeah. Yes. Any other questions? No town or no pump. It was outside Elston, Iowa, in Ringgold County. Whoop. Thank you. Oh, got some more over there. Let's send those up. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. Anybody else? We got them all? Okay. All right. So, now my book name is entitled The Boy from Pumptown. That's a working title, and my publisher, when I get them, which we'll have in the next few months, we think, has the ability to change the title. So by signing up, you will get notice of the title change if it changes. They may keep it because I've been advertising under that name. But also, I have another alternative name that I've kind of been toying with, and it's called Quick Fix, the untold story of the man who solved the uranium problem for the Manhattan or something like that. But Quick Fix is spelled Q-U-I-K-PHIX, spelled wrong. But that was the code name of their project in Ames, Quick Fix. So I kind of think that's neat. And I think the spelling is, might get people's attention. What, they don't know how to spell? So anyway, that's a possibility too. All right, so we're mixing them up. See if we can get one in here. Actually, I'm going to give two out because there's so many in here. So, first lucky winner is Joanne Kennart. Yay! Okay, and I'll draw one more. Cool. Excellent. Okay, here we go. All right, and this is Del Bloom. Yay! Great. Excellent. So I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I'm so thrilled to have such a great turnout. Really appreciate it.